Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Ask everyone here in-house, as Mallory and I have already done, to see that your cell phones are turned off. It's always appreciated. And, of course, our Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. As we begin, I do want to point out one aspect. Our guest today, is also a part-time Fox News commentator. Millions of Americans, of course, know Bill O'Reilly as the Factor. Mallory, in this case, has been a factor long before the Factor was cool. He is the John C. West Professor of International Politics and American Government at the Citadel. He is the host and co-founder of the New York Meeting, a nationally recognized gathering of elected officials, journalists, business leaders, and conservative authors in New York City. And he also founded the similar Charleston Meeting, which meets in South Carolina. He previously authored the New York Times bestseller, which he's too modest to advertise, Shadowbosses, Government Unions, Control America, and Rob the Taxpayers Blind. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and served as Vice Chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on Terrorism Financing. He has frequently testified before the House and Senate committees on terror financing, regulation of the financial services industry, and other economic issues. He also served as chairman of the Free Enterprise Fund, a free market, as he says, do tank, advocating economic growth, lower taxes, and limited government. And they also brought the challenge to Sarbanes-Oxley legislation before the Supreme Court. And of course, today we're featuring him on Big Tent, where we learn a little bit about our own movement, leaders in it, and their recollections leading up to where we are today. Please join me in welcoming our good friend, Mallory Factor. Mallory?
Thank you so much. John, thank you so much. What a great introduction, and again, thank you for hosting this meeting. What a better place to speak about the conservative movement than at the Heritage Foundation. I want to thank Heritage for its support of the Big Tent Project. Many people at Heritage were instrumental and deserve my thanks, starting with Ed Fulner for his early support of this project and for contributing forward to Big Tent. Thank you, Ed, for forever urging me onward. General Ed Meese for contributing the critical chapter on Reagan. Lee Edwards for his keen observations on the early version of this manuscript. Most of all, I'm grateful for Heritage's fine work in conserving and renewing principles of the American founding. My friends, I grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the home of Phineas Taylor Barnum. P.T. Barnum, as he was known, was the greatest circus showman in history. Let me paint a picture for you of how it was when I was a boy in an industrial New England city and the circus came to town. A mile-long train with 60 cars pulled into the train station. Trucks moved the loads onto the fairgrounds, and local kids began to gather to watch the roustabouts unpack. Finally, they set out the 3 huge rings and raised the big tent, which seemed to us impossibly big. It held the promise of a thrilling spectacle of flying trapeze acts, tightrope walkers, a human cannonball, fire breathers, and lion tamers. And then, just then, when it seemed as if things couldn't get any more exciting, the roustabouts set up the sideshow acts, the parade of human curiosities, the freak show. These were the real mysteries of the circus that children yearned to see, and yet that also haunted them later. Bearded ladies, Siamese twins, Chang and Eng, the living skeleton, the giantess Anna Swan, Zip the Pinhead, the lion-faced man. My friends, this show would certainly offend modern sensibilities, but it was wildly successful. As P.T. Barnum put it, nobody ever lost a dollar by underestimating the taste of the American public. The American public is still interested in sideshows. That's why every day the mainstream media portrays the conservative movement as a sideshow, and they present a parade of horribles. Candidates who are portrayed as uncaring about the needs of women and minority groups. Politicians who are said to promote xenophobia and fear of immigrants. And rich old white men who are seemingly focused on lowering their tax rates and preserving their wealth instead of paying their fair share. Day after day, the media tells stories like these in lurid detail. Through these reports, the entire conservative movement is depicted as a parade of human oddities, just as shocking and just as fascinating as a circus sideshow. And many conservatives fear that the media-reported freak shows may turn the next generation away from conservatism. In considering this situation, it's important to start with the observation that on many levels, America is a conservative nation. Earlier this year, the Washington Post reported that conservatives outnumbered liberals in 47 of 50 states. But note, my friends, conservatives, not Republicans. In fact, 38% of Americans self-identify as conservatives, but less than 25% self-identify as Republicans. As we all know, there's a widespread dissatisfaction with the Republican brand among conservatives. Reasons include attacks by the establishment Republican Party on conservatives, disappointment with the party's choice of candidates, and the Republican Party's endorsement of certain big government policies. The Republican Party started out as a movement gathered around an idea, the idea of ending slavery. The Republican Party began as an abolitionist coalition of Northern Whigs, Free Soil Democrats, the American Party, and other anti-slavery groups. At a meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin, in March of 1854, abolitionists expressed their alarm at the spread of slavery into the Kansas-Nebraska territories, and they floated a name for a new political party, the Republican Party. And this is March of 1854. Just 8 months later, the new party had taken over the House of Representatives and many state houses as well. Circus promoter P.T. Barnum himself was elected in 1855 as a Republican to the Connecticut State House. And in 1860, just 6 short years after the party was founded, Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected to the White House. Well, the Republican Party started out as an idea-driven movement. Today's Republican Party is an established political party. For both parties, ideology is far less important than party politics, even though ideas motivate and invigorate the grassroots. In contrast to our two political parties, the conservative movement is, and always has been, an idea-driven movement. Conservatism has several important intellectual pillars. Now, if you follow the mainstream media, you can probably rattle those pillars off. And the mainstream media would say racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, economic inequality, and militarism. And President Obama personified this viewpoint when he talked during his first presidential campaign about small-town Americans who, and I quote, cling to their guns and religion or have antipathy toward people who aren't like them. But this is not what conservatism is about. The conservative movement is not about people who refuse to embrace progress and have been left behind. The movement is actually about the people who hold tight to core principles and hold essential truths that are needed to save our beloved nation from tyranny. We all know what the real core pillars of the movement are. One, the respect for religion and tradition of past generations. Two, the maintenance of the rule of law. Three, protection of individual freedom and liberty. And four, belief in a higher law above man's law. The ideas that hold conservatism together are rooted in man's most important values. These are the values that the American nation was founded upon: belief in ordered liberty, freedom, and a nation under God. The American founding was an assertion by colonials that they were entitled to the rights granted to Englishmen. It was an evolution rather than a revolution. And in the book, Big Tent, Speaker Gingrich, in his contribution, reminds us of this. And these same pillars have brought new generations into the movement for decades. A movement has to have some pillars we all agree on, or the whole tent falls down. When leaders in our movement fall away from core principles, which they sometimes do, we must step back, re-examine our course, and select new leaders. But what is conservatism really? Conservatism as a political and social philosophy is ancient. The personal human impulse to defend and fight for one's most cherished convictions is natural and is timeless. Conservatism as a guiding philosophy for social life, education, cultural institutions, and government is natural and ancient. The word conservative comes from the Latin prefix con, which means with, which when combined with servare means to guard, keep, or save. It conveys the idea of attentively guarding something for the purpose of safekeeping. Perhaps because of association with guarding, many people confuse conservatism with blindly upholding tradition. But traditionalism fails to capture our movement adequately. Conservatives recognize that tradition may be wrong or without meaning. Tradition may be missing essential truths and moral substance toward which conservatives strive. Tradition may need correction. Conservatives have reverence and respect for tradition, but are not inseparable from it. Conservatives have numerous reasons that they fight. Conservatives want a government that functions according to the rights given to us by our Constitution and respect for our Anglo-American political heritage. Conservatives want a government that is ordered and maintains the rule of law. Conservatives want government to protect freedom, liberty, and property, and not to choose winners and losers. Conservatives want government to leave people alone to the greatest extent possible, to allow them to use the fruits of their liberty to build their livelihoods, and to let people worship as they see fit. Conservatives understand that there are objective truths that must be defended, sides that must be taken, battles that must be fought. Conservative principles stand in stark contrast to the Democrat Party's slogan at its 212 convention, which you probably all recall: government is the only thing we all belong to. If the American people start believing government is the only answer, it will be a wretched ending indeed for our great American experiment. Conservatives first came together as a modern movement in the 1950s and 60s. This is well-established history, and I'm sure all of you in this room understand that. The modern conservative movement has emerged as a big tent with three central poles: national security conservatives, social conservatives, and economic conservatives. The idea of a big tent harkens back to the late Republican strategist Lee Atwater. In 1989, regarding conflict with the Republican Party, he said, "Our party is a big tent. We can house many views on many issues." While Atwater was speaking of party, the conservative movement can and should also be seen as a big tent. Conservatism is advocated by people with a wide range of views on defense spending, national security, foreign policy, legalization of drugs, abortion, marriage, immigration, and numerous other issues. We debate all these issues among ourselves, often clashing fiercely with those in our movement who disagree with us about policy. This vibrant and lively internal debate within the conservative movement stands in stark contrast to the orthodoxy of the left, which seem to adopt the position of no enemies to the left. On the left, special interest groups join in a grand coalition. Each group gets legislation that benefits them in return for their support of other coalitions' members' interests. This approach assures that all the groups on the left get their piece of the government pie, whatever the cost it is to the nation. The idea behind the big tent was originally P.T. Barnum's innovation. It was P.T. Barnum who started the quintessentially American circus with a traveling canvas tent that could be set up in town after town after town on the American frontier. When the crowds grew, P.T. Barnum just added more poles and expanded the tent to fit in more patrons. The conservative movement has taken P.T. Barnum's lead and enlarged the tent. But the result has been frequent conflicts that reveal the deep intellectual and cultural rifts between major constituencies in the conservative movement. My friends, the conservative movement is a truly big tent. A big tent of people sharing common principles, but with wildly different worldviews. The movement includes paleocons and neocons, evangelicals and atheists, traditionalists and libertarians, foreign policy hawks and isolationists, the Tea Party and the establishment, just to name a few. Many of these groups really and truly dislike each other. I mean, it is amazing how much they dislike each other. But they come together in support of the conservative movement's pillars, but not frequently enough. Our conservative movement is noble in many ways, but in one way, it certainly falls very short. Many conservatives would rather burn heretics from different wings of the movement than unite and fight the infidels who are actively attempting to tear down our beloved country. In the American conservative movement, conservatives of one stripe put in place litmus tests on certain issues important to them and keep out other conservatives that don't agree with them. The result is the movement often seems fractured and divided in the media and in the popular imagination. Over the course of American history, conservatives have had a difficult time electing candidates to Congress and the White House who have shared their principles because conservatives have never been represented by a single political party. Even today, yes, even today, conservatives are split 19% of Democrats self-identify as conservative. 35% of independents self-identify as conservatives. And my friends, 30% of Republicans don't. To have the opportunity to govern, conservatives had to come together as a political movement and then align with a political party to get candidates elected. As a practical matter, conservatives rely on the Republican Party, and they rely on it to get conservative politicians elected. And this usually involves compromise on some issues. Although, my friends, it does not mean it has to involve throwing out core principles. The movement became closely associated with the Republican Party during the election of President Ronald Reagan in 1980. Although the conservative movement and the Republican Party remain closely aligned, it's a very uneasy partnership. Conservatives complain that the Republican Party doesn't represent the tenets of the conservative movement faithfully. And the Republican Party finds conservative groups focus on ideology, and they're troublesome and they're problematic for the party. There's an emerging narrative leading up to the 2016 election that's being advanced by both the media and the Republican Party. The narrative holds that Tea Party, libertarians, national security conservatives, and social conservatives, and this depends on who you're talking to, of course, that they're ruining the chances of the Republican Party taking the White House, possibly ever again. At the most basic level, these conservative groups pose a great challenge to the Republican Party because these groups are focused on ideology rather than party politics. But of course, you know, as I do, at times, these so-called troublesome groups include everyone in the big tent, except possibly the Republican Party loyalists themselves. Many grassroots conservatives fear that America is facing an imperial presidency, and that tyranny now is more possible than any other time in our history. This position is probably one of the hardest for progressives to understand and the hardest for the Republican Party to deal with. Another tough issue for the Republican Party is social conservatives. The media and even some other conservatives attack social conservatives, and they attack them very hard when they express views inconsistent with their liberal worldview. But whatever the elites, both Republicans and Democrats, may think of social conservatives today represent the core of the Republican Party. The Republican Party, in its present configuration, cannot win elections without them. Evangelicals constituted a whopping 27% of the electorate in 2012, with other types of religious conservatives contributing an additional 10 to 12%. You may recall the media uproar in the U.S. over the comments about gays by Duck Dynasty patriarch Phil Robertson. The outrage led to Robertson being suspended by the A&E network. But the broad support from prominent conservatives from all wings of the conservative movement resulted in Robertson being taken off suspension, and that was only about a week after the controversy erupted. This example shows that when the broad conservative movement defends the statements of conservatives, the conflict dissipates and the media backs down. This stands in contrast to the example of two Republican senatorial candidates in 2012. And you all remember Aiken and Murdoch. They were abandoned by many wings of the conservative movement as well as the Republican Party. Question is, are the Phil Robertson case and the Aiken Murdoch cases different because of the statements each made? Maybe. But it's also possible that the main difference in conservative unity was that Aiken and Murdoch were candidates for office and Robertson wasn't. Other wings of the conservative movement didn't like Aiken and Murdoch. They didn't like them to begin with, and they fought hard against them in primaries. So when the opportunity arose, these other wings quickly came out against these candidates in hopes of replacing them with other candidates who would represent their particular ideology better. As we all know too well, many of the worst public divisions in the movement result from conservative wings fighting each other in primaries and the political arena. The truth is this: for conservatives to win the right to govern, three core groups of the conservative movement, foreign policy conservatives, the social conservatives, and the economic conservatives, will have to work together to elect candidates. And for the foreseeable future, the conservative movement will have to use the Republican Party to get its candidates elected, or simply lose. But there will continue to be many freak show moments when the interests of these different groups collide. In P.T. Barnum's Circus, this freak show was a hugely popular attraction. It was so popular, in fact, that P.T. Barnum couldn't get his patrons through the sideshow as fast as he would have liked. Some would linger there for hours. So, he solved the problem by posting a huge sign over the door that read, "To the egress." Curious patrons went through that door and found themselves outside, learning what you already know, that egress means exit. Yes, conservative leaders wish they could find such a simple way to show their troublesome factions to the egress. But the conservative leaders can't agree among themselves which groups should be cast out of the movement. The conservative movement remains a movement of ideas. But ideological purity may be the enemy of victory. It's the role of conservatives to generate new ideas and policies. But conservatives also need to join together to get these policies implemented. Only by winning the right to govern can conservatives bring freedom and liberty to our nation. My friends, core conservative principles cannot be violated, but policy differences need to be tolerated. Governing according to conservative principles will allow our exceptional nation to thrive and prosper. That, my friends, is really the contribution that the conservative movement can make to our nation and the world. I want to thank you for being with me in the big tent.
And we'll be glad to take questions. When we do pass the microphone, we would ask if you'd be so kind to identify yourself and an affiliation if there's an appropriate one, as a courtesy, of course, to our guest. How could you have ever thought of P.T. Barnum circuses and roustabouts and come to Washington, D.C.? I'm amazed. One other quote, of course, famous among conservatives is, "We always gather the wagons. The trouble is we shoot inward instead of outward." Questions from the audience? Mallory couldn't have told you everything, Jerry.
So,
He tried, but he couldn't.
a lot of conservatives, like myself, we're looking around and we think that the tent could use few more people. And so we're looking at the other side, and who do you think from their coalition are people that we should be reaching out to?
Well, I think we saw something very interesting happen recently with one of the contributors to the book. We have 17 contributors in the book, by the way, from Phyllis Schlafly to Ed Meese, from Michael Barone to Rand Paul. Rand Paul gave a speech at CPAC, got a standing ovation. He gave the same speech almost at Berkeley and got a standing ovation. We need people like that can cross over and actually get involvement from a broader spectrum. And there are other people like that. I think Scott Walker's doing some of those things, Bobby Jindal. But that's a perfect example of how you can do it, and I think we need more of that.
To the ingress sign, right? Next question. Oh, come on, gang. I knew you had to. Behind you, Andrew. Can't see.
Thank you very much. If I could just make a correction, I work for Reagan Revolution. And you can't tame a lion, you can only train a lion. There's no corrections.
Thank you. I'll take that under advisement.
I went to CPAC recently and was greatly encouraged by the youth that was there, and here as well. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps give them a message that would encourage them to reach out, as the gentleman said here, to the Big Ten.
Well, I think the real message is that we don't want to, I mean, the four core principles, and we should be talking about those rather than a lot of policy detail and getting bogged down on fighting each other over that. I mentioned this to a member of Congress, it happened to be Steve King, and he used it actually in a speech yesterday. And he was surprised that the four core principles resonated with a number of people. So Congressman King used it. But and he is not a contributor to the book. The way we came up with those principles, we went through all these 17 people, from Haley Barbour to Ed Fulner, from Michael Barone to, I mean, I'm leaving out, to Doug Feith to Don Rumsfeld. And we found that these principles flowed through all of them. Even Yaron Brook, who heads up the Ayn Rand Society or Foundation, I think it's called, these core principles resonate. And I think we get too caught up in trying to fight each other over policy differences.
Another question before we dismiss? Here down in front, toward the front.
Hi. You said that the American Revolution was more of an evolution than a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
I think Kirk said something similar. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the relevance of the Declaration and its ideals to the way in which we interpret the Constitution? And is that something that conservatives should be united on?
That's a really good question. My wife is an attorney, and she believes in black letter law. Other people believe in using the Declaration. I think that that's a question beyond my ability, but I will tell you that we live in two nations almost. And I saw something, Pew Research, which is just an excellent organization, did a piece of work recently. And they asked people what they felt about abortion in almost all cases. You may have seen the research on it. It was fascinating. 75% of people in the Northeast said that abortion should be available in almost every case. 60% of people in the South disagreed with that. Gay marriage. 62% of Northerners absolutely for it. 61% of Southerners against it, or not for it. I mean, it is just fascinating to see how we are really two nations. And if you really pay attention to the Declaration of Independence, you could almost use it again. So I'm not going to go there. And that's why I was bringing that up. But it is shocking to me how we really. And I've lived in both nations. I used to live in New York. I now live in South Carolina. And we really have two different cultures in two different countries. And it's getting harder and harder to bridge that. And I don't know how we do it, I really don't. I will throw one other thing. I mean, Kirk said wrote something many years ago that I think is just so important for us to look at today. And he talks about the 4 cities that are absolutely important to Western civilization. He talks about Jerusalem giving us true law or divine law. He talks about Athens giving us the basis for social order. Rome, the idea of republic with the separation of powers. London, the universality of law applied equally to all. He then talks about it culminating in Philadelphia, which I think it has, and with the American experiment. And I think we're losing those 4 key Western principles. I think this particular administration is helping us even lose them faster. But I worry about that. By the way, the first chapter in the book is by Al Regnery, and he talks about that at great length. And it's really pretty interesting to read about that in the first chapter with Al, who is just a great American. Is there any? Oh, great, thanks. I love it.
In light of these comments,
Microphone, please. Sorry.
yes. Thank you. In light of these comments and the division within the country, maybe we could focus on your great concept of attacking the infidels before we burn the heretics, even within the conservative movement. Do you have any thoughts on how we can do that?
Tough, not really. I think it's a matter of us continuing to talk about what are our core principles and working together on that. I think that is one of the hardest things to do. And the Aiken-Murdoch versus the Robertson example, I think vividly shows how everybody's trying to elect their guy, and to the detriment sometimes, frequently to the detriment of our country and to the detriment of the conservative movement. I don't know how we do it. I mean, I worry about it. I worry about it daily. And again, the left is far better organized. What I like to think about is something that Reagan is credited with. And he talks about the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is a friend and an ally. He's not a 20% traitor. And I think we have to keep reminding people about that, because I think that is just so important. And in the book, Ed Meese, who contributed a chapter, Ed Meese from the Heritage Foundation, talks about that at great length. And I think there's a lot there to be said. I don't know how we keep reminding people. Maybe we tattoo it on every single member of Congress's and every state legislator's hand or something. But I just don't know how we do it.
Or does Laura still have hers? We'll get you since you stayed on.
As I understand it, you are teaching at the Citadel, is that right?
Yeah, and I'll be teaching at Cambridge next year as well.
Okay.
In
So my
UK.
question relates to.
You just lost the Oxford audience.
Relates to
What's
your,
Oxford?
to your observations about young people over the years. Have you seen changes in their behaviors and attitudes that either encourage or discourage you with regard to conservatism?
It's a great question. Great question. Our president has said that he wants colleges and vocational schools to train people for jobs for our society. I'm waiting for college kids to come back telling them that they're being trained to be baristas. I think that they are recognizing that, given what's happening in our society, and that they see younger people, see that you need to have free markets, you need to have individual freedom, you need to have individual liberty to be able to keep this great American experiment going. And I think you're seeing that. And again, I use the Rand Paul example from a speech at Berkeley. I mean, I can't believe that Senator Paul, a social conservative, it's a standing ovation of a general crowd. It wasn't a crowd that he put together. It was a general crowd at Berkeley So I think we're doing something, we're seeing something happening that's very good, and I think it bodes well. But with all these changes that are being made, and I believe illegal changes, unconstitutional changes by the current administration, it's going to be hard to unwind some of these things. I know that's not a great answer, but I hope it answered a little bit.
Yeah, I think it goes to the last comment about the young people and how we are attacked and vulnerable. I think the three things you talked about being, the one being social issues that are the biggest divider, and you spoke about also North and South divided on social issues. And I think where Rand Paul got his standing ovation was that he's a libertarian, pretty much. And I think that as long as the social issues are something that people dig their heels in about, I don't think government needs to tell us what to do about social issues. I don't think they have any business in that area of most people's lives. So the Democrats use that because they know we're divided on it, and they just ram that between conservatives to pry them apart. And I think the reason Rand Paul got that standing ovation, and all the young people I know who are conservatives, they don't have problems with most social issues. They really just feel the government should butt out of them.
Yeah, I agree with you almost. I agree with you completely. And but I like to come back to history. And for those of you who are students of history, in '76, the first evangelical president was elected, Jimmy Carter. He was elected with 66% of the evangelical vote. Evangelicals got mad at him. And 4 years later, he lost, with Ronald Reagan carrying 64% of the evangelical vote. My point is that social conservatives have to be kept within the big tent structure, or we will lose, unless we completely reformulate, and I don't know how that's going to happen. But I agree with you that though, and I can't speak for Senator Paul, I know the man, but he is a social conservative to the best of my knowledge. And, but that's not an issue that he just tries to ram down people's throats. And I think that's what you're getting at. I agree with you. That's important. Yes, sir.
My name is Ken Hagerty. A concept that I didn't hear in your presentation, which I think might be useful, is to ask about the concept of American exceptionalism. How do you relate the concept and all of the ideas and the freight of the term American exceptionalism to the outline that you're presenting here?
Interestingly enough, again, we have 17 contributors in the book, and one of us is Newt Gingrich. He talks about that in the book, and he basically says we are losing that because of the way we're stifling our markets, our government is being involved in everything. And it is by freeing people that we can keep this exceptionalism, this American experiment going. Obviously, you remember the quote, and I don't remember it exactly, what President Obama said about American exceptionalism, about his British exception. I don't remember the whole quote. And that is the problem. I believe Democrats and liberals are striving for uniform mediocrity.
That's true.
And feel that American exceptionalism is wrong. I don't. I believe in our country. I believe in America. I believe in American exceptionalism. And I believe that by having a big tent held up by poles that are core poles or pillars, that we can save our country and continue this great American experiment.
Did you?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Please.
Where'd my,
Yes.
where'd my
We need-
person go?
We need.
I see him running.
Thank you. Mark Levin and supporters of his argue that given the size of government, given the complexity of laws, that you really need fundamental constitutional reform done, proposed at the state level, because even if we get even if we get good people on political leadership positions, the permanent bureaucracy, the permanent government is really going to block efforts to reform. What thoughts do you have about
Well,
that?
one of the problems, you talk about the permanent bureaucracy, I think bureaucrats today are really politicians with tenure. And that's what's happened. They haven't become civil servants. They become politicians with tenure. Yeah, we need reformation. I don't know how we're going to do it. I mean, the states are becoming less and less important. These 50 places of experimentation are being shut down. It's, I think it has to start in Washington first. I think Washington is the key to unleashing these 50 places that can really produce innovation. I think Washington is where it has to start and filter down.
Do we have a final question, or was that it? That looks like to have been it. Thank you again, Mallory.
Thank you for joining me in the Big Tent.
And of course, copies of Mallory's book are available here for sale. He will stay in here and can autograph them, or I'm sure he may even wander outside and talk with you too. We do thank you for your kind attention and hope to see you again soon in the future.
Thank you all.